I will speak about the changes in the strategic environment in the Middle East, but I think it's very important to start with what unfortunately didn't change. Most of the things that are extremely problematic in the Middle East have not changed. And I want to speak about these, about the changes that we have seen recently and the kind of changes that we can expect, but later to speak about the ability to deal with these changes, because we have a very major challenge in the region, both for the United States and for Israel. And I believe that the ability to deal with these challenges must be discussed, because in the final analysis, what is important, if you look at it from an Israeli perspective, from an American perspective, and even from a Middle Eastern perspective, is not just what are things and what is getting worse and how difficult it is going to be. And I promise no optimistic comments whatsoever about the Middle East. And if any of you can tell me about anything optimistic about the Middle East, I'll be delighted. It will be new to me, and I will be delighted to hear about it for the first time. But then, before you're completely depressed and consider suicide, I will come to the question of response, because very much like in intelligence, and I've been involved with intelligence for a very large part of my life, it is important at the end to come to some kind of a net assessment. Namely, you say, here is what they can do to us if we don't do anything, here is what we can do to them, and here is what we believe the outcome will be when they and us get together and there is a conflict. In the Middle East, it's not exactly a conflict, because I'm not speaking about the Arab-Israeli dimension. I'm going far beyond it. The challenge that the Middle East presents is the very fact that it is dysfunctional, and I will in a moment elaborate about it. So the challenge is not how many missiles, how many cannons do you have, and how many tanks will be rolling on aircraft flying. But what do you do with a system that doesn't function, that produces very serious difficulties, first of all, for the people of the Middle East themselves, and then to others? But let me start with what, unfortunately, didn't change. I'll be delighted if it will change. And before I even start telling you what has not changed, let me emphasize it can change. I am not giving you a static picture of the Middle East and saying this is what it will be forever. But these changes don't take weeks, don't take months, don't take years. In many cases, they don't even take decades. They take generations. And before they bear fruit, they need to start. It's a prerequisite. And if they haven't started, or if they're changing in the wrong direction, saying that things could change is interesting, but not necessarily very cheerful. It's like this old saying, one day I was sitting in my room feeling gloomy, then a voice came out of the darkness and said, cheer up, things could be worse. So I cheered up, and sure enough, things did get worse. So in the Middle East, things are bad, they're getting worse. They can get better, but they haven't started. And if the so-called Arab Spring would have started them, it would have been great. I'm looking at this spring, and I think that Vivaldi should rewrite one of the passages in the Four Seasons if this is anything even comparable to spring. But let me start, as I said, with the structural problems. And again, structural problems can change. They're not forever. But we don't see a positive change. We only recently, in recent decades, started discussing the option of failed states. Until a few decades ago, we assumed that if a state doesn't function, there won't be a state. And since then, we've accepted that certain states are there and will probably be there for a long time, but they're failed states. The Middle East is moving in the direction of being a failed region. The Arab Middle East is moving in the direction of being a failed region. Look at each and every country in the region. Look at Syria. And it's not something new. The only difference between Assad Sr. and Assad Jr. is that Assad Sr. killed 30,000 people in one go, and Assad Jr. is doing it over 2 years. But it's the same concept. either the regime kills his opponents on a scale that they're afraid to rise, or they rise and then they kill them when they rise. And Syria was not a more hopeful country 30 years ago or 2 years ago than it is today. And if you look at Lebanon, if you look at Jordan, at Yemen, in Sudan, in Libya, in all the places where we had civil wars recently, Iraq, take one country after another, we have a structural problem. This structural problem starts with the fact that for the last 200 years, the Arabs have a problem with modernity. They tried to modernize in the last 200 years since they came in contact with the West, the cultural West, not the Cold War West, the cultural West. And they're struggling with it for 200 years without very much success. Now, the interesting point is the following. The failure is 200 years old. The recognition of the failure is less than 20 years old. The understanding in the Arab world that they have failed on a massive scale in dealing with modernity is something that Arabs started admitting only recently. Since I'm in this business so many decades, I can still remember very well when I would speak to an Arab audience and I would say the Arab world is a massive failure and people would rise up and protest and we would have very interesting discussions. Today, when I speak to Al Jazeera in Arabic and there isn't even, I don't even have a monitor, I just have a camera facing me and I don't know if I'm speaking with somebody in Doha or in Cairo or in London or here in this city, and I say the Arab world has failed, I don't get any argument. In most cases, people will say on the other side of the line, I don't even know who they are. Yes, we have failed. There is this understanding. And the problem is that the old traditional social order in the Arab world that functioned perhaps not very well, but it functioned, is no longer there because when it came in contact with the West, it changed in a way that made it much less functional. And the new order, the new social order that they wanted to adopt, a more modern one, they did not succeed in adopting. So they're neither here nor there. They're in limbo between two social orders. They didn't manage to produce a functioning synthesis between the old tradition and the new reality. Now, for that, you don't have to abandon your culture. The Japanese have kept their culture and became adjusted to the modern world. It's possible. You can do it, and others did it. The Arabs tried to do it. There is a fascinating literature about it, how they tried very seriously. It was very interesting to watch, but they failed, and they admit their failure. And this produces a permanent, structural instability in the region. And what you have in many of the countries, not all of them, but in many of the countries, there's some noted exception, Egypt is one, Morocco is another, is not nation states in the modern sense of the term, but something that I would perhaps call a conglomeration of tribes. Look at Syria today. Look at Lebanon always. Look at, again, most countries in the Middle East. There are few exceptions. I mentioned two. There are more. Basically, if you look at the mainstream in the Arab world, this is the problem. This didn't change, but it is bad enough as it used to be, and now it's getting worse. And it's getting worse on a number of levels. Let me take at least 6 or 7 of them and just mention them. We don't have enough time to go into each and every one, but just mention them. First of all, the Middle East is dominated today by radical ideologies. And we may say, because we adopt a Western yardstick when we come to deal with non-Western societies, we may say, well, you know, these are words. Look at the deeds. I mean, here is Morsi. He may have in Egypt a very radical ideology of the Muslim Brothers, but look how he behaved in the Gaza Strip. He behaved in a very pragmatic way. And if you're a pragmatic, you can't be a radical. this is a misperception. There hasn't been in history one single radical who's not also a pragmatic. I believe Hitler was somewhat of a radical, I think so. In Munich, in 1938, he was pragmatic. I mean, if the British capitulated, why not accept their capitulation? That's fine, no problem. The fact that people also behave pragmatically doesn't mean that they're not committed to radical notions. And between words and deeds in the Middle East, words count more than deeds, because in the final analysis, the deeds adjust themselves to the words. You start out by very radical ideas. You teach your public, you educate your community, you educate your children in the spirit of these ideas, and then this is the norm, and you cannot legitimize diverting from this norm, and for a while you manage to manipulate people and do what you know is best, but in the final analysis there is so much pressure on you that you end up doing exactly what you want will lead you to the wrong place. You yourself know that you shouldn't do what you said should be done, and in the final analysis you do what you said should be done because you cannot withstand the pressure. To give only one example, this is how the Six-Day War started. Nasser tried to prevent it between 61 and 67. And he himself generated the inevitable process that in the final analysis led to the eruption of a war that he said will be a calamity for the Arabs because the Arabs are not prepared for a war with Israel. King Hussein is even a more extreme situation. He wanted peace more than anybody else in the region. I wish all Israelis were as pro-Zionist as King Hussein was, because he understood he needed a strong Israel for the survival of Jordan. He wanted peace, made war in 1967, and took the right step. Because making war, he only lost one bank. Had he not made war, regardless of the outcome, he would have lost 2 banks, everything he had, and the top 12 inches of his physical existence. And I believe that the fact that he called his memoirs Uneasy Lies the Head was true in more than one sense. He understood exactly how uneasy the head of a Jordanian monarch lies. So when you have this gun on the table in the beginning of the theater piece, it will shoot in the last part of it. The radical ideologies bring people in the Middle East who know how unrealistic these ideologies are and know how serious and how detrimental the consequences of these ideologies are. They lead them to take steps that bring about what they never wanted to bring about because they're committed publicly to these ideologies. And here is the second thing that people who don't understand anything about the Middle East call democracy in the Middle East. The Arabs have a better name for it. They call it the Arab Street. The Arab Street is the most radical, most irresponsible, and in some cases even barbaric expression of public opinion. And the Arab Street indeed became much stronger recently, in the last 2 years. And this is terrible, because this is exactly what forces relatively responsible governments in the Middle East to take irresponsible action, because the Arab Street forces them to go in a direction they don't want to go in the first place. They have to show loyalty. If they're not loyal to what people shout out in the street, to what the mob shouts out in the street, they must be agents of the CIA or of the Mossad. And very often, they can get killed just because this is the perception in the public. And when the Arab Street becomes much more potent, and this is happening in the Arab world generally, this is the major product of what happened in the Arab Spring, then the leeway of a government to behave in a way that they believe is best for them is becoming even narrower. Let's take something on a completely different level. In the Middle East, there are actually 4 countries: Iran, Turkey, Israel, and Egypt. The rest of the Middle East, well, an extreme way of putting it would be to say that they are a cartographical misunderstanding. I mean, most countries in the Middle East are not nation states in any accepted sense of the term, based on a political community that function as a whole, with all the differences that you have in political communities all over the world. But the only countries that are real there are these four. Three of them are going in very, very negative directions. Iran, I don't have to tell you. By the way, you have in Iran a society that is impressive, pluralistic. One day, if we get rid of this repulsive regime, in Iran, I have very high hopes for Iran and for the impact of Iran on the region. But the regime manages to get its way for 33 years now, and I don't see the end of it coming immediately. I'll be delighted. We should have tried in 2009. We didn't. But as long as it's there, everything in Iran is extremely negative. In Turkey, we have a counter-revolution. The tremendous achievements of Kemal Atatürk since the 1920s are being reversed with popular support by the Erdogan government. Negative. In Egypt, it used to be the anchor for a long period of time, since Sadat and during Mubarak's time, the anchor for the anti-radical forces in the Middle East. At best, Egypt will be dealing with its own problems. At worst, it will follow its radical teachings of the Muslim Brothers. But it will be a major problem even if they stop doing the good thing, let alone if they start doing the bad thing. But the fact that there is no leadership for the responsible countries in the Middle East, if you speak about Saudi Arabia, about Jordan, about a small country, Morocco, a small number of other countries, without the leadership of Egypt, they're not even half as effective as they were with the leadership of Egypt. A number of other things that seem to be minor, but we don't understand the implication of it, is also very negative. I mean, look at the changing nature of war. We used to be able to say that radical countries and even terrorist organizations, in the final analysis, they are weak, because when we confront them, we can defeat them. But what we've seen in the Middle East, and we've had only 2 weeks ago a good demonstration of it, the Arabs have managed to shift the war from a war between armies, where a modern, sophisticated society has a tremendous advantage, to a war between two civilian populations, because they target with rockets Israeli civilian population, and they embed their rockets in their own civilian population. And for them, a war is a win-win situation, because if they kill Jews, they're delighted, and if we kill Arabs in pursuit of the missiles who are fired into our cities, they're even more delighted because it looks good on television. And this shift gives hopes to the radicals. If you want any kind of stability, you have to frustrate the radicals and to empower the more responsible forces. This shift in the nature of war empowers radicals. It's enough if you are a small terrorist organization supplied by a regional power, Iran in this case, with strategic weapons, because any weapons that can reach in very large numbers the major city of your enemy are strategic weapons, and a small terrorist organization like Islamic Jihad in the Gaza Strip can get instructions from Iran to start a war. And the hope that it gives to the radicals is much more dangerous than the missiles. You look at the international community. When you look at international organizations, they become more and more prostituted in terms of supporting the most radical and the least responsible actions, because you have a huge automatic majority. In the United Nations, I'm only waiting for the day where Israel will be blamed for killing the Dead Sea. They're working on it right now. And it is so ridiculous if you look at the substance, but if you look at the political impact of it, you can't laugh. The joke is on us. And the problem is not that Sudan and Zambia and Somalia vote for it. The problem is that the Europeans are going with them because they want something that they call the international community to speak about an international legitimacy. And who do you grant international legitimacy? Look at what is happening in the Human Rights Commissions, for instance, of the United Nations. There are other very negative developments, particularly among European elites, both relating to anti-Semitism and to a total negation of the legitimacy of the use of force, even in extreme cases. But I think I've said enough about the basic negative forces that are working there, and some of the forces outside the region, like what I've mentioned here about Europe, are dangerous not because Europe itself can cause direct harm on a major scale, but because the fact that the most radical elements can get tremendous support in Europe encouraged them to be more radical. The problem with everything I said here this evening is it encourages the radicals and it undercuts responsible governments. And I'm not speaking about right and wrong, good and bad. I'm speaking about people who cannot use their own judgment about what is good for their own country. And that's very negative. So everything I've told you about is depressing. I hope you're depressed enough. I have more. If somebody wants in the Q&A, somebody feels he's not depressed enough, I'm willing to make the experience more perfect. But for a moment, I'd like to speak about the response, because again, what I want to reach at the end is some kind of net assessment. Yes, the dangers are enormous. Yes, they're growing. Yes, it can cause enormous damage. But the question is, can you mitigate the damage? Can you have some damage control? Do you have ways to deal with it? And more important than anything else, can you build a structure based on your own civilization that makes the effects of all the negative things that I've mentioned so far less harmful to you? Now let me say what I believe we can and what I believe we can't. We can't change the Middle East. And by the way, it doesn't matter if somebody comes with the ridiculous notion of bringing democracy to the Middle East with the Marines or bringing democracy to the Middle East with speeches in Cairo. Democracy in the Middle East is like bringing patience to Israel. I don't know how many of you have some experience with Israelis. There is a term that I would use even better than that if you want to be more ridiculous. It's a German term, Gemütlichkeit. If you can bring Gemütlichkeit to Israel, you'll bring democracy to the Arab world. And the question is not how. The question is, can you come to this region and produce something that doesn't have enough local forces pursuing it? I'm saying not that they are not. I'm saying that they're not strong enough. I'm saying that when they go into Tahrir Square, I knew from day one that they're going to lose. And I'm sorry. My heart bleeds for them. And I spoke with many of them 2 years ago, and I told them, you will inevitably fail. The chances are 0. One day, I don't know. Foreseeable future, you will fail. We can't change the Middle East. We can't do something that will make these countries more responsible and more and less violent and more stable to the point where the overall picture of the Middle East will change in the near future. When you're an Israeli stuck in the middle of the Middle East, and you speak about peace, and some of my Israeli friends have a developed sense of humor and are speaking sometimes about peace, I keep asking them, look how Arabs treat each other in Syria, in Lebanon, in Jordan, in Sudan, in Libya, in the Yemen, in Saudi Arabia, in Iran. Look at the region and ask yourself, do you expect that they'll treat Jews better than they treat their own brothers, better than they treat each other, better than both sides in Syria treat each other today? And I'm sorry to say, it's not the government who are all the bad guys and the opposition who are all the good guys. Some of the good guys in the opposition I wouldn't like to have too close to me. These things we can't change. And if I may use the Serenity Prayer, I would say that I'm here to represent the third part. In other words, there are certain things we have to resign ourselves to, we can't change. We need to have courage to change the things that we can change, and more than anything else, particularly in academia, what is lacking more than anything else is the distinction to tell one from the other. And that's what we need to do here. We can't change the Middle East. But we can do a lot about behaving in the region in a way that will make the dangers smaller, that will make the damage to us much more limited, and will make it possible for us to live in this region irrespective of the very negative tendencies that are happening there, and do what we need to do. And most of what we need to do is not to build more iron domes, although I'm for it, and we should, is not to come up with some new device that will convince journalists to look at real life. This is something that is very difficult for journalists. They're accustomed to come to a region for 3 days and then write a book called The Middle East, Yesterday, Today, Tomorrow. I mean, there's things you can't do. It can't be done. It's a given. You will get a distorted picture because this is what reporting is all about. Okay? We all know that Jews are news. We have in Israel more journalists per capita than any society ever in human history. So Jews are news. We know, every journalist knows, that bad news are news. So bad news about Jews is ultimate Jews, ultimate news. Okay? And it's there. And learn to live with it. Don't try to pretend as if when you will have a better hasbara or a better Iron Dome, the problems will go away. You should have a better hasbara. It can't be worse, so let it be better. You need more Iron Dome, yes. But most of what we can do has to do with what in my book is the reason for the success of Zionism and the failure of the Arabs. And later in the Q&A, I will also speak about the United States. If somebody is interested, I'd like to focus on Israel. Why did Zionism succeed and why did Palestinian nationalism fail? Because Palestinian nationalism was always concerned about maximizing national objectives. And they never give up. And very often, it paid in the short run, but the long run consequences were so catastrophic that if you look at them today, after 90 years, you say to yourself, wow, I mean, this is one of the great failures that you can possibly imagine. This is a national leadership that brought to its people suffering. If you look at the major reason why Zionism, in my view, is one of the greatest successes of modern times, it is because we didn't try to maximize national objectives. Right from the very beginning, Zionism gave up most of Zion. Zion is the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. The settlers are right about it. Everything that is important for Jewish history happened in Nablus, in Beit El, in Hebron, in Jerusalem, in this area. Not in Ashkelon. To Ashkelon you go if you need a haircut. But if you, look at Jewish history, we basically came and we said, the land we really wanted is heavily populated by Arabs. Let's go where the Arabs didn't want to go because it was considered worthless to them, namely the coastal plain and portions of the Galilee and the Negev later. So the whole approach was build a society. This is what you came for. You didn't come here to the land of Israel in order to kill as many Arabs as you can or to defeat them in wars. You came to build a Jewish society. So focus on this. And if you look at Israel today, you will see that not only it built a society with many problems, but basically giving Israelis a good life, but also that building a society reflected itself in having a very developed science, and the science reflects itself in the fact that Israel is the most advanced country in the world when it comes to missile defense. These things are interrelated. And the most important contribution that you can make to deal with such problems is to build a strong society. Because a strong society can have millions of people sitting in bomb shelters for a week and then coming out and saying, well, it was just one of those things. This country has hurricanes and earthquakes and mudslides, and we have the Arab environment. Different countries have different natural disasters. It comes and goes. This is something that we cannot eliminate. We can try to break the power of our enemy. We can try and usually succeed, get very good deterrence. But you learn to live with this reality. And Israelis today realize that for the foreseeable future, they will have to live with it. Now, would it be nice to have peace? Yes. If I may quote a great strategist, my grandmother, she used to say in Yiddish, it's better to be rich and young and healthy than sick and poor and old. So, would it be nice to have peace? Yes. Most Israelis are resigned with the fact that this is not something we're going to get. It's cold in the winter, it's warm in the summer, and from time to time, Arabs try to kill us. I mean, they try every day, but from time to time, it erupts into a major war. And you can be nice to them, like Rabin taking Arafat to get the Nobel Peace Prize, or you can be nasty to them, and it's irrespective. This is an area where pluralism is simply not known. There is no such thing. Not vis-a-vis their own women, not vis-a-vis their own children, not vis-a-vis Christians, not vis-a-vis homosexuals. It's simply not there. So you learn to live with it. And a society that has given up on peace is stronger than a society that believes in something that is totally unrealistic. Now, interestingly enough, the Israeli society doesn't believe in peace, but is willing to make many more concessions than ever before. What is the logic of it? You go today, you ask Israelis in public opinion polls, are you for negotiations with the Arabs? Overwhelmingly, yes. Are you willing to partition the land? 70%, yes. Are you willing to make today more concessions than a year ago? Yes. Do you expect to be making next year more concessions than today? Yes. Will that bring peace? No. And I love it because it's inconsistent. To me, inconsistency is synonymous to grown up. The most consistent people I know are 15 years old. Anybody who remains consistent after marriage should have his head examined. I think that this is something that you need to learn. Okay? Again, when you're 15 years old, it's very impressive. And Israelis have learned that the most important thing is to have a strong society. Now, how do you judge what a strong society is? They will tell you, and you must have read it in all the newspapers, in other words, it must be wrong, only 2 days ago, that Israel is moving to the right. Only somebody who's completely without any kind of understanding about the Middle East, a journalist, would say so. Israel has moved to the center. Israelis have adopted one tremendously important tenet of the left and another, perhaps the most important, assumption of the right. They have taken from the right the assumption that peace is not an option, and I'm delighted they did. They have taken from the left the understanding that the land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean needs to be partitioned, and I'm delighted that they did. And this is called moving to the center. And you judge the strength of a society by its response to crisis. Look at Europe in the most important crisis in Europe in modern times, the Great War, the First World War. Countries have either radicalized or capitulated. The Germans have radicalized, the British, the French have capitulated. This is a weak society. A strong society, the Israeli society, gravitated to the center. You have today very few people in Israel who are radical left. Even the most left party, Meretz, is more like a ticket to Disneyland than any left, hardcore left concept. There are more to the right, primarily the ultra-Orthodox. They're very, very much to the right. But about 60–70% of the Israelis, more than 2/3 of the Israelis in my judgment, are somewhere in the center, in different varieties of it. If somebody is interested, I can give a few examples later, but this is what strengthens the Israeli society. You have a strong society, A, because we have successfully dealt with the most important problem of the Israeli society. I'll mention it in a minute. And B, because we've moved to the center. What was the most important problem of the Israeli society? The Sephardic-Ashkenazi rift. Let me remind you, only 30 years ago, in the 1981 elections, it was on the verge of eruption. Today, only 30 years later, there are more than 1 million Israeli children who don't know anymore if they're Sephardic or Ashkenazi. The Israeli Central Bureau of Statistics stopped counting people, stopped categorizing them because they couldn't do it anymore. It doesn't work anymore. If anybody would have told me 30 years ago that this would happen, I would say that this person is completely disconnected from reality. It's an achievement, by the way, an achievement Israelis are not willing to take responsibility for. Israelis are never willing to take responsibility for achievements. In Israel, you have the old Jewish sickness that is unfortunately genetic for Jews. A Jew can only feel good when he feels bad. If a Jew doesn't feel bad, he doesn't feel good. There's something wrong. He must feel bad about something. I don't know, perhaps our Jewish mothers are responsible for it with their guilt shtick that they're giving us. But if you look at Israel absorbing bringing the Moroccans, the Russians, and the Yeshuv society into one people, we used to be a conglomeration with an ideology of a people. We are a people today, and we don't even celebrate it. It's not self-evident. It could have failed. It succeeded. It could have failed. That's more important, to have a society that has already passed the point where it accumulated enough critical mass to perpetuate itself as one collective. This is much more important when you face a turbulent Middle East, violent and unstable as it is, than more tanks or more aircrafts. Look at the Israeli economy. I remember times in Israel where we didn't have enough to eat. Today we're spending more on dieting than Africa spends on food. We're basically in a good condition in Israel. I should be careful not to say it to the fundraisers here who portray us as nabachs. Okay. But we're in a very good position. And if you look at the strengths of the Israeli society, this is the most important thing that you need when you live in an area where it will be constantly challenged. 30, 40 years ago, even 20 years ago, people who would, have children would say, my son was born today. When he grows up, he will no longer have to go to the army. Today they say, my son was born today, let me make sure he gets his place in Golani. By the way, the fact that people want to go to Golani is a miracle in itself. I mean, you should know a little bit about the history of Golani to understand it. What I'm suggesting here is that the Middle East gives us only bad news. I don't see in the foreseeable future anything that will alleviate the difficulties. The situation, if you just look at the challenges, they're much worse than before. But if you bring together for net assessment the challenge and the ability to deal with the challenge, we are in a very, very good place, certainly compared to things that we have gone through in the 1950s, in the 1970s, where the situation was dramatically worse than today. And these positive indications are not only objective, but also are reflected in something much more important, in the response of Israelis. Watch the most important public opinion poll in Israel. Usually public opinion polls in Israel have a sample of 508 people. Once a year, the National Bureau of Statistics asks 33,500 people what they think about their situation. And what you get there, I believe Israel is number 2 in the world in the level of optimism of its citizens. And here again, it's interesting. You ask people, what is the situation of Israel? And they say, terrible. And then they ask them, what is your own situation and your friend's situation and everything that you know? And they say, great. Okay? So they pay their taxes to their Jewish mothers by saying that our situation is terrible. And then they say, my life is great. Now, of course, if you read the newspapers, they will bring those who will say that the economy is collapsing and Israel is becoming, the left would say fascist, the right would say traitors. You have all this hysteria that goes on there. If you want to understand Israel, stop reading the English edition of Haaretz and your understanding will be catapulted to a new level. Okay? Once you realize that the big picture has nothing whatsoever to do, even with correct information that sometimes appears there, but is not reflecting the overall picture. And to conclude, I would say the following. My not only characterization of the present situation, but my characterization of the trends in most things that relate to the Middle East are very negative, and they're negative for Israel or for anybody else who wants a good life and a stable life in this region, or to the United States. The question is, what do you do when you're faced with a challenge of that magnitude? And I want to end by telling a story, and some of you have heard this joke before. It's not funny, but it's so good. And if you forget my whole lecture, as I hope you will, the one thing I ask you to remember is this joke. It's about God Almighty, who comes to the conclusion that he wants to, that he's sick and tired of the human race, and he wants to bring a flood. But this time, comme il faut. A flood, wie es sich gehört. A flood that completely destroys everything. And he calls the leaders of the three monotheistic religions and he says to them, go to your people and tell them that in 2 weeks it's over. So the Christian comes to his community and he says, look, we've sinned and we need to pray and we need to do good deeds for 2 weeks and maybe they'll let us through the pearly gates. And the Muslim says, we've been so perfect, so let's be perfect for 2 more weeks and everything will be okay. And the Jew comes to his community and he says, guys, we have 2 weeks to learn how to live underwater. I think it's a different paradigm. I recently visited Finland, and then another thing came to mind, because I've used this joke so often, it bores me. So I needed something else, and it was very, very, very cold in Finland. And I thought to myself, if somebody comes and says, you'll have to live all your life in 20 centigrade below. I don't know how much it is in your funny way of measuring temperature here. But very, very cold, okay? And you will have to live in the open all your life. Is it good news or bad news? Depending. If you're a polar bear, it's spring, okay? Israel is a polar bear. I mean, we can take it, and we're twisted enough to enjoy taking it. So what I'm saying is these dangers become worse every day, but you don't have to lie to yourself and say, oh, democracy is coming. Spring is coming. When somebody tells me spring in the air, I ask, why the hell should I? The notion that because things are bad, we must cheat ourselves about what they really are is not the way to address it. And at least the Israelis have addressed it in a very different way. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan, for a real tour de force. We have some time for questions. When you ask a question, please identify yourself and pose your question to Dan. I think based on what you've heard, you need not worry that you might hurt his feelings by asking a tough question. Let me start by asking you the following. A generation ago, Israel had neighbors. It was part of Ben-Gurion's strategy to ally with non-Sunni Arab populations, in which Turkey, Egypt, well, Turkey and Iran certainly, but to some extent Egypt, once the peace treaty was signed, were not overt antagonists of Israel, and in some cases, Iran under the Shah and Turkey prior to the current regime were in fact de facto allies of Israel. Now you have all three of them led by regimes that are bitterly critical, even hostile to Israel. You have the Arab awakening, which is producing a massive, to use Martin Kramer's, I think, phraseology, an Islamist populist wave, which is likely to dominate the region for the foreseeable future. And despite the pragmatism of people like Morsi, reflects a very radical and hostile agenda vis-a-vis Israel. Why is that not a reason to be more pessimistic now than one might have been, say, a generation ago?
If we would have had a generation ago the problems we're having today, we may not have been in a position to deal with it. If we had the kind of hostility and anti-Semitism of the elites in Europe 2 generations ago, as we have today, we may not have been in a position to deal with it. Luckily, the worse things are becoming in the Middle East, the stronger Israel becomes, and it's our job to see to it that we become stronger faster than they become more dangerous. But you're right. I mean, we don't have anybody, even Saudi Arabia, that has identical interest with Israel, not similar, identical interest with Israel. It cannot, in the atmosphere today in the Arab world, work in a way that will be perceived as helping Israel. So we are in a much more difficult situation. But the reason I'm not pessimistic is that we became dramatically stronger in the period where things became dramatically more difficult.
Good, I feel better already. All right, let's start with questions. Nancy Sherman.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you, Nancy Sherman, in philosophy here in Executive Committee of the Program for Jewish Civilization. A few years ago, I was in Israel at the Hartman, where I go in the summers in June, and Michael Walzer was giving a talk. And he said something that was very moving and was very disruptive to the audience. And that was that, given his study of Jewish history, we were much better at being persecuted and oppressed than we were at leading, and that we should take a lesson in leading. And so I want your comment on that, and also the hope that you give us that Ashkenazi and Sephardics can live together. Is that a hope for more general kind of peaceful coexistence?
No, let me start with the second question. No, because Sephardic and Ashkenazim believed, if you ask me historically, I'm not sure if they were right, and I don't care, that they belonged to the same people, and they had some solidarity. There is zero solidarity between Jews and Arabs. I mean, we have these fairy tales that we're all sons of Abraham, and that's very nice, only nobody buys that. But other than the fact that nobody buys it, it's great. I mean, you can build an NGO and you can get dumb people to finance it, and it's fine, and it's great. But there's no substance to it. Jews have convinced themselves, I'm delighted to say, that we have that we have so much in common that we can afford, and that's an interesting thing about Israel, you must have noticed it, we can afford to curse each other on an ethnic basis for fun. I mean, I don't know something that Israelis enjoy more than calling their friends names based on an ethnic basis. And for somebody coming from the United States, it sounds terrible unless you realize that the same people are getting married. I mean, they're basically, you know, training before marriage what we will be doing after marriage anyhow. So, pardon? Yes, 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 and I'm delighted that this culture became broadened to in a way that Moroccans can do it with people from Poland. Okay? By the way, we have one problem in the Israeli society that to me is the curse of the Jewish people, and that's the Ultraorthodox. Okay? And the Moroccans who didn't want to modernize and didn't want to accept the same values as Ashkenazim had before, they went to Shas, okay? They went in the direction of the Ultra-Orthodox. So I'm not painting a rosy picture of Israel.
But what about the first part of the comment? So Walzer's...
I'm coming to Walzer. Look, if somebody wants to be good as persecuted, you know, even as persecuted, I want to be bad. The very essence of Zionism and why Zionism is such a success is that it totally rejected this notion. Namely, we don't want to perfect our persecution status. We want to change it, and we managed to change it. We're not victims, okay? Do people try to make us into victims? Yes. Are we victims? Of course not. So I'm not interested if we're good victims or bad victims. I don't want to be a victim. I don't want to be persecuted. Now, if I'm persecuted on a personal level, there is very little I can do about it. If I'm being persecuted as a collective, some of the people who are trying to persecute me, I can ignore because I'm strong enough to ignore them. And with others, I will take into consideration that I have to be more careful. But I don't want to find a way of being better persecuted or have my situation as a persecuted collective be more perfect. I'm not interested in that. Why? Maybe I misunderstood the question.
I was asking, do we have lessons in leading and in governing?
No, look.
That's
no.
the issue.
Look, the Western world is in a crisis of leadership. The kind of people that I want as leaders in the world would not be elected today because it doesn't look good. okay? The Churchills and the Ben-Gurions and the FDRs would not have been elected to office today under the prevailing circumstances. And that's a fascinating discussion we can have somewhere else. Do we have a serious problem of leadership in Israel? Yes. Do they make them any more like they did Ben-Gurion? No, but also not other great leaders of the world. We are in short supply of leadership in the world in general, including in this country, some people tell me. Okay? So this is not an Israeli problem. This is a problem of Western societies, Western open societies, that did not manage, moving more into the liberal side, did not manage to maintain the position of leadership that is today more necessary in our societies than ever before. And I put it to you that this is true in the United States, and it's true in Europe, and it's true in every democratic country. Show me the great people today. I don't see them.
Next question, Professor Lieber.
Yes, Lieber the Younger, School of Foreign Service and Security Studies program. Two questions. First, on the sunny side of your talk, strong Israeli society and all the rest, I wanted to pick up on the ultra-Orthodox issue. And really the question is should I walk out of here far more optimistic than I was when I left Israel this summer after my last visit, when I sensed, not based on reading Haaretz, but in my time there, that this is a big and looming problem. And it is a much deeper problem than I appreciated before I went there this last time. And why should I be not worried about the ultra-Orthodox and the influence they're having on...
Very worried. The ultra-Orthodox, I repeat, is the curse of the Jewish people. These are parasites that whatever they want is the extreme opposite of what we need for a strong Israeli society. And I am outraged at my political leaders who don't put at the top of the agenda to form a government without the ultra-Orthodox, and to deprive them of all the money they steal from us every day, and to force them to work. And they will not work unless we force them to work. And this should be this is what I'm trying to say to Israeli leaders, should be their first priority. I was outraged at Tzipi Livni when, instead of suggesting this, and this is what we discussed, and we didn't have any argument either. In the Israeli political system, my personal friends are Ehud Olmert and Tzipi Livni. So I spoke to them. I also spoke to others about the subject. And I said, what are you bringing me this notion of peace with the Palestinians? The chances are zero. It will not happen. There isn't the slightest chance in the world. Our most urgent thing today is to establish a Zionist government. And the exclusion of the ultra-Orthodox should be our first priority. Should you be worried? Yes, you should be worried. But be worried on this subject doesn't mean that you shouldn't be impressed by everything else in Israel.
Sure. And every time I go, I can't wait till the next time I'll go back. It seems like a nice place to live.
Right.
But if we're looking for a crack in this strong foundation, that would be the first place to look.
And yeah, that would be the first place. By the way, the second place is the Israeli education system. It's a total failure. Okay? We are waiting for it to crumble because we never fix anything before it completely crumbles. So there are other cracks, yes.
Second brief question. On the dark side, the portrayal of the Arab world, and I agree with your argument that there's very little that anyone can do, and the international community, the U.S., and presumably Israel, to bring democracy to the Arab world, especially at the barrel of a gun, unlike the beliefs of some neoconservative views of this. But you also said at one point about 2009 that Israel missed a chance.
Not Israel, the United States.
Okay, the United States missed a chance to take care of the despicable Iranian regime.
To help.
To help.
To
but
help
this
bring it down
suggests
when
that
the
you
Iranians
think that
themselves went out in the street.
I think there's a little bit of an inconsistency, right?
Why?
Because you suggested that there's nothing anyone can do to further the cause of democracy. Maybe we should intervene in Syria and help the rebels there. Or maybe we should intervene in Iraq and build democracy there.
No.
What's the difference?
First of all, there's a tremendous difference. There's a difference between occupying a country hoping to bring democracy to it, which I think is ludicrous, and when the people themselves rise to help them without sending the Marines in Iran. And here is, look, in Syria, you have bad news and bad news. And they're fighting against each other, and I have sleepless nights. It's terrible, okay? And Iran, where the good guys are fighting against the ultimate bad guys, and we didn't even encourage them. And I thought 2009 was a major mistake. And by the way, even if it doesn't work, trying here is important morally. It is important as a message to other people who want to rise. It is important for the next round of people in Iran who have the enormous courage to go out in the streets and fight this barbaric regime. We need the very little we should do, we should do. We can't change Iran. We can't bring democracy to Iran. But when a pluralistic uprising, and Iran, it is a pluralistic, unlike Syria, in Iran, it is a pluralistic uprising. When this pluralistic uprising tries to gain track in Iran, we should help as much as we can. Now, can the two of us sit and discuss what yes, what no? For instance, should American aircraft supply them open internet channels and suppress the Iranian attempts to close the internet? Yes, this you can do without sending American soldiers in order to fight there, okay? But even that we didn't do. We didn't do anything. And I think it was a mistake, and there's no inconsistency.
Before I ask for the next question, just a couple of observations, logistical, not substantive. I want to thank Audrey Anderson from the staff of the Program for Jewish Civilization and Melissa Spence, our Deputy Director, for organizing this event tonight. Also, I introduced a couple of people earlier. Let me also say Wayne Firestone is here, who's been the brilliant head of Hillel for the past 10 years. And also Martin Kramer, who is a man who needs no introduction, but Martin is the incoming dean of the new Shalem College in Israel and divides his time between there and the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. With that, additional questions. I noticed there were a number of hands raised before. Don.
Don Lossman, National Defense University. I'm a little less optimistic about the situation in the military strategic position than you are, and although you're a hard guy to ask for optimism. But if Iran gets nuclear capabilities, I suspect there's going to be a mushrooming of nuclear capabilities throughout the region. I suspect there may be some leakages, and maybe bin Laden types will be able to get their hands on it. And I think that changes the whole calculus of threats and existential threats. After 67, probably Israel didn't face a direct existential threat. But I think now it's highly, much more probable if Iran is able, because I think there'll be a mushrooming. What are your thoughts on that, please?
Well, first of all, if we speak about nuclear weapons, the United States faces an existential threat, doesn't it? Every country in the world faces an existential threat.
Drop a bomb here or there.
Yes, but
We'll have a country left.
well, the question is, what do they expect? My concern is not that one day the Iranians will come and drop a nuclear bomb on Israel. I'm concerned about something that we all should be concerned about. The world as we know it will come to an end, okay? Because the United States will no longer be the leading power of the world when nobody can trust the United States, when you have 6, 7, 8 nuclear countries in the region, when you have 30, 40, 50 countries in the world that will have nuclear weapons. You will have here Hugo Chavez with a nuclear weapon. When the clown gets then the circus isn't funny anymore, okay? So the reason we are so obsessed with Iranian nuclear weapons, and we should be, is that the world will change. Now, this world will be also very bad for us, but also bad for everybody else. So if you would say, well, here is something that threatens Israel and the rest of the world will not care because it threatens only Israel, we are simply more in the front line. I mean, we are the canary, okay? And therefore, we sing our song. But I don't think that this should in any way undermine. First of all, there is only one country in the world that has a missile defense system. I mean, every country in the world is more vulnerable to Israel, to nuclear weapons. Does it mean that nothing can come through? No, nothing is 100%. But 90% isn't bad. When everybody else has 0%, 90% isn't bad. So again, you can say, well, look at global warming. Look at terrorism spreading. Yes, the world is full of nasty things. But compared to other nations, we are better prepared to deal with it than any other nation on earth. This in itself is not bad. You know, if somebody says to himself, oh, there is so much terrorism in Israel, I'll go to Bali. Oh, no, the Twin Towers is a better place. Oh, the Spanish train, the underground in London. These things happen everywhere. I remember 1968 when people kept telling me, this was the first time an aircraft was abducted to Algeria, oh, it's an Israeli problem, the occupation or something, right? Once it succeeds there, the whole human race is affected. Now, when you fly, it started with Israel, but when you fly, you want to be safe. Would you rather fly halal? Okay? Or would you take somewhere where the air marshals are polite? Okay? We address every question with a 9mm argument. Okay? Sometimes 22, depending, because you don't want to have a hole too big. So compared to others, we don't live in a perfect world and we're the only imperfection. We live in a very imperfect world, and we have there are two differences. A, they want to kill us more than anybody else, and B, we can defend ourselves better than anybody else. But other than that, we're like everybody else.
Next question, in the very back.
Tom Parker with George Washington University. Could you comment on the debates that have gone on in Israel about what would be best for Israel vis-a-vis Syria, the Syrian opposition? Has there been a consensus, or has there been a variety of views?
There isn't very much debate in Israel on the subject. I don't know of any two clear schools on the subject. Basically, you know, we can't afford to go beyond the question, are there any dangers? Are there any opportunities? The dangers are there, but if these win or that, in Syria, nothing good can come out of it. The good guys are a minute minority. They cannot be the force that will lead there. The alternative to the repulsive Assad regime is a Muslim Brother regime under the tutelage of Turkey, with very serious implications on Jordan. If there is one thing I'm frightened, is the Arab Spring getting to Jordan, because when a buffer state implodes, this affects the whole region. And I'm afraid that if the Muslim Brothers win in Syria, then in Jordan, the Muslim Brothers will be encouraged to try things, and they work with the Palestinians and other radicals and so on. So at the moment, what we say is, well, it's a pity, but that's the Middle East. You know, there is this joke that every Israeli knows, and it's about the scorpion who comes to the frog and says, will you take me to the other side of the Nile? Says the frog, am I crazy? You'll sting me. Says the scorpion, am I crazy? I'll drown. So the frog takes the scorpion on the back, and in the middle of the Nile, the scorpion stings him. And the frog says, yes, but reason. They said, that's the Middle East. Okay? You live in a place where you see people who you know, when they are done being butchered, will butcher the other side. So there is no moral gap where the good guys are there and the bad guys are here. Is it better for Israel to have a stable Syria? Yes. Is it dangerous that chemical weapons will get into the wrong hands? Yes. But there is no real opportunity of establishing something in Syria that will be pluralistic, that will be a candidate for peace with Israel. I don't think it's a realistic proposition, and I don't know of a real debate.
More questions? Yes, right over here.
Thank you. Melvin Garbo. I'm just a superannuated resident of the community. It appears that the Arabs in the West Bank are attracted by economic opportunities and are willing to go along with a fairly oppressive lifestyle if they can succeed economically. Is that likely to sustain itself, or will the West Bank Arabs follow suit with the Egyptians?
I'm delighted that you started your statement by "it appears." Okay? Yes, it appears. But I don't think Arabs under Israeli occupation are more oppressed than in any Arab regime. So, is it nice to be under occupation? No. Is it nice to live in a free Arab Syria or Lebanon or Sudan or Libya or anything? No. Now, economic opportunities can help for a while, and then people are usually motivated by ideological concerns. It doesn't have to be a majority. It has to be only a very determined minority who the majority does not dare to marginalize. Let me give you an example. On the eve of the so-called Second Intifada in the year 2000, the Palestinians were doing better than ever in their history. And then in one day they started a war that ended by Israel occupying the West Bank, and then they really suffered. Not enough, if you ask me, but they really suffered, okay? And things became much, much, much worse for a long time. Did the fact that they were doing very well economically stop them from, adopting a very radical, belligerent, violent course of action? No. We all have some, simple-minded Marxist concept that people become radical when they're poor. The Saudis are not poor, they're radical. Muammar Gaddafi and his ilk were not poor, they were radical. Rich people can be radical. The question is not you become radical when you have nothing to lose. This is good for journalists. Let's come back to the real Middle East, okay? You look at the terrorists, they have nothing to lose. Only recently, the Arab International Organization of Lawyers, that is a part of UNESCO, gave a prize to a lawyer from Jenin who got up in the morning from a very comfortable living, took the bus to Haifa, went into a restaurant, Maxim, and killed 20 people and exploded herself with her. And this is considered an act of heroism by the Guild of Arab Lawyers. When Egyptian soldier or police guard, to be more exact, in the Sinai, killed a number of Israeli children and threatened the parents that if they helped their children who were bleeding in front of him, he will kill their other children, he became an honorary member of the Writers' Guild, of the Lawyers' Guild. I mean, he was illiterate, but he was an honorary member of the Writers' Guild. So the assumption that education breeds radicalism is not substantiated. It's not the ignorant and the poor that are radicals. It is people who have something much more fundamental. We refuse, and particularly in this country, to recognize that radicalism is a legitimate category of people. Somebody is radical only because he had a difficult childhood and he wasn't given a good enough opportunity to get things in the legitimate way, so he does it in the illegitimate way. So let's be nice to him and he will stop being radical. Let's give him more money and he will stop being radical. Let's give him more opportunities and he will stop being radical. It doesn't work this way. Now, does it work this way sometimes with some individuals? Yes. But is that the explanation for the phenomenon? No.
We have time for one more question. All right, let me, Martin Kramer over here. We'll take two. Martin Kramer there and the woman in the back. First, Martin.
Dan, could you address the significance of the U.S.-Israel relationship as an element or component of Israel's strength? And is it something about which...
US what?
U.S.-Israel relationship. And is it something about which you're optimistic or pessimistic, and do you see any possible danger that the trends you've noted in Europe might make the Atlantic crossing?
I am very optimistic about Israeli-American relationship, in spite of the fact that I am very aware and very often infuriated by certain events in American-Israeli relations. But look at the fundamental structure of these relations. First of all, regardless of the presidents, every year our relationship becomes stronger. Even when we had a hostile president, like Jimmy Carter, the worst president this country had in modern times, if you ask me, even under Jimmy Carter, the relations between Israel and the United States improved. What Americans and Israelis have in common, what the American people and the Israelis have in common, is an ethos. And we are the only two nations on earth, I think, perhaps there is another exception, but at least the most outstanding, that combine a genuine and deep commitment to an open society and pluralism on the one hand, and the willingness to defend liberty by force on the other. And I would say that we're the only ones who have a combination of a heart and a spine. I would use other parts of the anatomy, but I was told to be polite. So a heart and a spine at the same time. The Europeans may have a heart, but they don't even know what a spine is. Most countries in the world don't have a heart because they behave towards their own people in a terrible way. Here you have this very strong feeling that liberty is not self-evident and therefore needs to be defended. And when it needs to be defended by force, defended by force. When I look at people at the Air and Space Museum watching the Enola Gay, I feel very, very good because they realize you never know why you need a B-29 again. Okay, because we live in a dangerous world and we are willing to do something against it. Compare it to the British attitude to Bomber Harris and the Bomber Command. They're the only ones that didn't get the Victoria Cross for the Second World War. I think that I'm the only one who comes every year to Bomber Harris's statue and I put a wreath there. Okay, the Brits, I'm not sure do it. Perhaps the British Air Force, but it's not a major celebration in Egypt, in Britain. The Europeans, since the First World War, are willing to capitulate to whatever thing they can. And this reflects itself in the fact that they always burn American and Israeli flags together. I was asked on the Hill many years ago, how long will the special Israeli relationship with the United States last? I said, as long as they're burning our flags together, we're in business. Because they hate us for the same reason.
Last question in the back.
Yeah, Shelley Tempton, the French department here at Georgetown. Just a question about your thoughts on the settlement policy, expansion of...
I thought, after 1967, that the establishment of the vast majority of settlements was a major mistake. Not because this is Palestinian territory and they deserve it, but because we don't deserve to cohabitate with them. And I am advocating in Israel for many years, and I managed to convince at least 2 prime ministers to change their views on the subject. I'm advocating unilateralism. I very strongly supported the disengagement from the Gaza Strip. I believe it is a tremendous success because I knew Hamas is going to take over. I knew we are going to get more terrorism, but my consideration was the following. The one thing we cannot do without is a strong Israeli society. And the only question I'm asking myself is the Israeli society stronger with Gaza or without Gaza? And my answer is without Gaza. And therefore, I'm for it. Is it a perfect way of dealing with things? No. Now, can we afford to leave the West Bank today like we left the Gaza Strip? No. The Israeli army will have to stay. But I would want to remove most of the settlements, the majority of the settlements, which, by the way, is only 20% of the settlers. So 80% of the settlements can remain in the settlement blocks. And the settlement blocks I supported. I thought it's a good idea. Okay? So I think that most settlements must be removed. And then, when we are in a position to remove the Israeli army, I'll be delighted. But until we're in a position to remove the Israeli army and until we know what Jordan will be, this is tremendously important. Okay? If you have in Jordan another radical state, then many things that I would love to do today, I wouldn't do. So for me, it's not an ideological question, it is a practical question, and this is the practical way I propose to deal with it.
Please join me in thanking Dan Schueftan.
Thank you.